We've been honored today, and not only honored, but it's been a real good experience to have with us Gary Fenstermacher. There is no more important issue facing us, I guess, than education, and because it ties into so many important things that which we all care about. It is the means by which we pass on those things we care about to the next generation. And we are committed to the improvement of education, and we're happy to have so many people likewise committed with us today. Professor Gary Fenstermacher grew up in a small town in eastern Pennsylvania. I learned this from him. It took only a few minutes to feel like an old friend to Professor Fenstermacher. And as the case of each of us, I think where we grow up and how we grow up is an important aspect in who we are. He was educated did his graduate degree, his doctorate degree in the philosophy of education at Cornell, was on the faculty at UCLA with John Goodlad, hired by John Goodlad, served there for a number of years, was on the faculty at Virginia Tech, Dean of the School of Education at the University of Arizona, and then spent 11 years as a faculty member at the University of Michigan, and is now a professor emeritus of education at the University of Michigan. He has consented to come and speak to us today and will address the purposes of education broadly writ. Is that fair? Professor Fenstermacher.
Thank you all very much. It's a real treat to be here. This is my fourth occasion over the last 25 years to be at BYU. It's always a heartwarming and just a great experience for me. So thank you all for being here this afternoon. The posters and flyers for this talk indicate that the title is Why We Educate. And that is indeed the title I thought appropriate when Richard Williams asked me to make the presentation several months ago. Perhaps that's just because I'd finished editing 2 volumes for the National Society for the Study of Education titled, Why Do We Educate? And the topic was very much on my mind. So I set out to write this address on the theme of why we educate and quickly ran into a problem. I got bored, frankly. I'm not sure why. I may simply have exhausted the subject or myself after working on those NSSE volumes for 4 years. Or it could be the result of struggling with this topic in one form or another for the 40-plus years of my education career. Whatever the reason, such cognitive abilities as I could muster were insufficient to turn that sow's ear I was fashioning at the keyboard into a silk purse. As you might imagine, this left me more than a little frightened about what I was going to say to you this afternoon. As I cast about for something different to talk about, something that would offer a measure of excitement for you and for me, something that would be the basis for a good conversation about education, but my muse just would not appear. Just as I began to wonder whether my career was over in more ways than simply being retired, the muse returned, right in the middle of one of the presidential debates. Yo, Gary, she called. Why don't you tell them what you would do to reform education if you were elected president? That's an interesting idea. So I returned to the computer, and sure enough, the words began to flow. Even better, I was no longer bored. I was just scared. The ideas spilling out were quite different from the systems of education now in place. Some might even call them radical. I wondered whether this was going to be fit material for public presentation, inasmuch as the ideas appearing on my computer screen most likely would ensure that I would not stand a chance of ever being elected president. Yet the more I wrote, the more it became clear to me that educational reform depends on some serious surgery on educational institutions. As these notions tumbled forth, I recalled a favorite verse from the book Archie and Mehitable by Don Marquis. Archie, as some of you may know, is a cockroach who fancies himself a poet as he hops from typewriter key to typewriter key, pecking out his verses. Mehitable is an alley cat who is Archie's companion and sometime protagonist. One of Archie's poems is about a conversation with a moth who was trying to get inside a light bulb and, as Archie says, fry himself on the wires. Archie asks the moth why he does this, and the moth's reply goes like this. We get bored with the routine and crave beauty and excitement. Fire is beautiful, and we know if we get too close, it will kill us. But what does it matter? It is better to be happy for a moment and burned up with beauty than to live a long time and be bored all the while. So we wad all our life up into one little roll, and then we shoot the roll. That is what life is for. It is better to be a part of beauty for one instance and then cease to exist than to exist forever and never be a part of beauty. Our attitude toward life is come easy, go easy. We are like human beings used to be before they became too civilized to enjoy themselves. Though I doubt what I have to say today comes anywhere near being burned up with beauty, I am emboldened by the lesson of the moth, so I plan to wad up those 40 plus years in education and shoot the roll. I may fry myself on the wires, but maybe in the words of the moth, that's what life is for. So what follows is my sense of a proper education agenda for a U.S. president with annotations rooted in my sense of why we educate. My first act would be to convene a year-long White House conference on the education of children, youth, and adults in America. Now, you might think that was a pretty milquetoast response for my first act as president. But let me tell you a little bit about why and what it would be like. It would begin by assembling in the nation's capital the very best minds on the topic for a week-long exchange on issues and problems of contemporary education and a design for education 2 decades hence. And during the remainder of the year, it would consist of 3 week-long assemblies to be held at various retreats around the nation, with a final 3-day event in Washington to present the findings and recommendations of the conference. Why should a new president begin with a White House conference instead of with legislation? Because whether I'm a Republican or a Democrat, I want to be cautious about the place of the federal government in the education of children and youth. My reason for this caution is more or less Jeffersonian. Decisions that greatly impact the everyday lives of citizens ought to be made as close to those citizens as possible. Furthermore, these citizens ought to have relatively easy access to the processes of decision-making which impact them so directly. I fear the alienation and the enemy that so often accompanies shifts of power to higher and higher levels of government. As power and authority shift to the upper levels of the system, those who occupy the lower levels often feel so much less a stake in the enterprise. This loss of ownership breeds a disinterest in the affairs of governing and quite often an unwillingness to take responsibility for the consequences of decision-making. Thus, I believe that the default condition for the democratic governance of educational matters is to vest with the people as much authority for governance as is feasible. This default condition is expressed in the Reserve Powers Clause of the 10th Amendment to the Constitution and is enshrined in the widely known notion of local control of schools. Some of you hearing me say this may already be guessing my political persuasion, perhaps speculating that my party affiliation might tend a little more to shades of red than blue, not unusual for Provo, I understand. And if perchance that thought's occurred to you, though, hold on for a bit, I might surprise you. Given my views on government, why convene a conference at the federal level? The answer is that first, it is a convenient way to bring many of the best minds in the nation, perhaps the world, to a reconsideration of an educational system that was designed in a time that is no longer with us. It is a way to focus national attention on critical problems such as the achievement gap, equality of educational opportunity, the forming of national character, and the role of schooling in the formation of a well-lived life. Second, a central purpose of the conference is to provide guidance, policy advice, and proposed model legislation to all branches and departments of government, whether federal, state, or local. And finally, it is a way for me to present my ideas to an attentive audience. And here they are. First, I would argue for a greater investment in the welfare of unborn children and infants. This investment to include guaranteed health care, covering nutrition and prevention, as well as illness and disease. It would also include a television channel devoted to good parenting, with the mandate that this channel be a centerpiece in the public service commitment of all broadcast and cable channels. Parents are both the primary caregivers and first educators of children, yet these are roles for which many are unprepared. Fortunately, physicians and midwives and hospitals now give more attention to preparing parents for their new roles, but there is so much to be learned. Different insights and understandings are needed at different times in the life cycle of the child. Hence, the need for a television channel that instructs parents on the various phases of care and education from pregnancy to young adult. Second, I would press for a reconsideration of when compulsory schooling begins and ends. It is my hope that the conference would embrace the notion of starting compulsory schooling not later than age 3 and ending it no later than the current grade 10. Quiet in here, isn't it? Yeah, that's kind of a novel. As you know, evidence continues to mount that the last 2 years of high school are unproductive periods for many students, while at the same time we have abundant evidence of the value to be gained with early education. An Associated Press that appeared in our local paper an Associated Press story that appeared in our local paper just a few days ago carried this headline: U.S. kids less likely than parents to graduate high school. If you spend much time in high schools, especially urban high schools, this datum will come as no surprise to you. Absent the extracurricular and co-curricular activities, high school is perceived by an increasingly large number of students as an experience strongly disconnected from their lives. The increase in examination requirements for promotion and graduation, along with the often mindless cramming that occurs in preparation for these examinations, adds to the disconnect between the schools and their students. And as will be noted in a moment, I believe there are better ways to engage the minds and talents of 16 and 17-year-olds. Along with this change in the age of children in public school should come a reconsideration of the school day and the calendar. Once again, we have evidence indicating that early start times for middle and high schools is utterly out of whack with the biological clocks that dictate the sleep rhythms of most teenagers. Starting and ending the school day at a later time could make an amazing difference in productivity of learning. The same is true for ending the long summer hiatus, for which we have abundant research showing the negative effects of retention of material learned in the prior grade as a result of the long summer break. The school calendar should be adjusted to shorten the summer break and distribute vacation periods more evenly across the year. Third, in place of high school's grades 11 and 12, there should be a requirement for 18 to 30 months of national service to be completed in the public sector, either military or civilian. Although often discussed, we have done little to bring this idea to fruition, save for such programs as Peace Corps and VISTA. This national service requirement should continue the education of youth in ways that reflect the application of things learned in school, as well as the cultivation of new skills and understandings. The military currently fulfills a great deal of this requirement with its enormous range of education and training programs for both enlisted and officer ranks, Peace Corps and Vista can also serve as models for what it means to continue the education of youth in a fashion different from what is typical of middle and high school settings. Fourth, every school should be a public school, regardless of the source of funding. Use of the word public here is not the same as is typically the case, where public generally means tax-supported. Here the term points to a particular kind of geopolitical space where citizens assemble to do the business of governance, whether that be the governing of neighborhood and community affairs, local, state, and national government, or the governance of associations, businesses, and volunteer agencies. It is a space where ideological interests and personal preferences are subordinated to the common good. A public school is a school that has as one of its core missions assisting in the formation of a public by preparing students for their roles and responsibilities as citizens. Such preparation involves the cultivation of attentive listening, respect for differences that define us as a people, the encouragement of critical and analytical skills, a regard for the role of fact and evidence in the forming of arguments, as well as a mutual caring for the welfare of one another. Hence, no matter whether the school is fully tax-supported and governed by an elected board, a private school, a charter or voucher school, or a religious school, it must also be a public school, insofar as one of its primary missions is preparing students for thoughtful, productive participation in the public square. To meet such a requirement, any school with an avowed ideological purpose must clearly separate that purpose from its equally important public purpose. It must explore and cultivate conceptions of the common good wherein all students, regardless of faith, of heritage, of language, of creed, are made aware of what we as a people, as a nation, and as a species must hold in common if we are to prosper and flourish. Fifth, each state would be required to expend approximately 10% of its budget in support of experimental forms of schooling. Such schools to have clearly stated purposes and objectives, as well as fully developed programs of evaluation. We are blessed with rapidly expanding bodies of knowledge, remarkable advances in healthcare, amazing feats of technology, and ever-deepening understandings of mind and brain. How might these advances be incorporated into our systems of schooling in the United States? The answer lies in fostering limited experiments in cutting-edge schooling where students are assured an excellent education while participating in new ways of coming to understand their world and their places in it. These schools are not simply different, as might be the case for a magnet school or a charter school. Rather, the innovations they attempt are rooted in well-developed theory, accompanied by bodies of evidence, and executed according to a plan that looks to eventual replication on a larger scale. Sixth, an expanded and enriched curriculum that attends as carefully to social studies, civics, and the performing arts as it does to language, science, and mathematics. This curriculum would be specifically designed to capitalize on this very simple but much ignored concept. As human beings, we are different. Not just in matters of race, language, and religion, but in what interests us and what does not, what we are handy at and what we are not, and what we care about and what we do not care about. This variation on Howard Gardner's notion of multiple intelligences must become far more obvious in the setting of the school than is currently the case. To argue for forms of schooling that recognize our individual differences and seek to nurture them does not permit us to diminish attention to that which we must have in common: proficiency in reading, writing, arithmetic, in rhetoric, the arts, the social and physical sciences, and in the understandings and skills that make us exemplary citizens. But it does mean that no one of these multiple subject areas will dominate the curriculum or be presented as more worthy or more important to success as other subjects. Seventh, There shall be options for advanced vocational and technical schooling following the period of national service. Such schooling would serve as an alternative to what we now know as the four-year collegiate program leading to the baccalaureate degree. It would be subsidized so that enrollment would be available at modest levels of tuition. It would include a liberal education component as well as disciplinary studies pertinent to the chosen vocation. This schooling may be considered terminal insofar as it would be sufficient to adequately sustain the student in a productive career, or it could serve as the basis for more advanced study in colleges and universities as we now know them. The reference here is to something more than the trade schools of yesteryear. It is instead to high-level technical institutes and to professional training that can be accomplished without a four-year baccalaureate program. In addition to preparation for careers likely to arise due to advances in technology and engineering, these advanced institutes might also assume preparation for some of the professional roles that are currently housed in four-year collegiate institutions. 8, we should undertake an extended consideration of education from the student's perspective. This consideration examines all the educational opportunities open to children and young adults, from scouting to church activities, from weekend athletic programs to parks and recreation programs, from television to the internet, from elective reading to travel, from play in early childhood to part-time jobs in the teen years. For far too long, we have viewed the education of the young simply as what takes place in schools, while ignoring the enormous array of educative influences and opportunities provided by other venues. These other venues should be studied for how their educational value is currently realized in the life of the child and how this value might be extended and improved. The central concept behind looking at education from the student's perspective is to gain a sense of all the formal, informal, and non-formal educational opportunities open to the young, and to grasp the child's education is not simply an expression of time in school, but is a result of participation in an extensive range of opportunities. This notion is carried forward in national service, which is designed to enhance the youngster's commitment to the commonweal and to continue his or her education through instruction provided by the military and civilian agencies. It also opens consideration of employer training and education programs and how these might be more productively linked to what occurs in schools, national service, and technical institutes and four-year colleges. Thus far, my advocacy has been limited to the structural and organizational features of schooling and the other means of educating children and youth. What about teachers and their activities in classrooms? Are there specific reforms that should be undertaken here? Reforms unlikely to be noticed if our inquiry were restricted solely to structural and organizational considerations. I believe there are, and propose that the conference attend to 3. They are: 1, the teacher's work environment; 2, a focus on teaching that cultivates both intellectual competence and moral sensibilities; and 3, reallocating the responsibility for learning so that it is shared between the teacher and the student. Turning to the first of these reforms, the teacher's work environment. If you have not taught in school, it can be difficult to grasp the challenges of that work environment. Having to plan ahead to use the telephone or the bathroom is among the more minor, yet not unimportant, inconveniences. Many of us are fortunate enough to work in work settings where we can pick up the phone when we remember there's someone we need to call, or go to the restroom when nature calls. In most cases, classroom teachers can't do that. But these are inconveniences they willingly trade for other more intangible and gratifying possibilities. Possibilities, unfortunately, that can be quickly eroded by poor administration, clueless parents, school boards in conflict, negative media attention, and marginally valid standardized examinations that drive curriculum, instruction, school reputation, and pay raises. Seldom do we ask ourselves what kind of work environment is most likely to attract the teachers we say we want for our children, and that enables them to do the job we ask them to do. Instead, so many of the actions we take erode that environment, from a failure to govern schools well to shaping state and national policies that institutionalize the mistrust of teachers and what they do. The massive testing program engendered by No Child Left Behind is a case in point. In a morally conscientious effort to identify and fix schools and teachers who were failing their students, the nation inaugurated a testing program that is having unintended consequences that far outweigh the modest benefits it is providing. These unintended consequences have brought about a huge decrement in satisfaction for those teachers who find joy in their work, who delight in developing instruction uniquely tailored to their students, and who seek fulfillment in realizing the outcomes of their own carefully developed plans and lessons. It's fascinating, I think, that in the midst of the extraordinary economic downturn we're now currently experiencing, we're reminded that trust is at the core of economic prosperity, a point made compellingly by Francis Fukuyama, where he said, "Trust, social trust, is the unspoken, unwritten bond between fellow citizens that facilitates transactions, empowers individual creativity, justifies collective action in the global struggle for economic predominance. The social capital represented by trust is every bit as important as physical capital." And I would argue that trust is as important in education as it is in economics. Yet so many contemporary policy initiatives in education corrode trust and thereby diminish the quality of the teacher's work environment. It would, I think, be a great leap forward if we treated our teachers the way we want them to treat their students, with dignity, with trust, with adequate resources, with allocations of time proportional to requested outcomes, and with a range of evaluative devices that permit recognition of differences in talent and specialty. The second teaching reform is a renewed and refurbished focus on the teacher's preparation for and ability to cultivate the intellectual competence and moral sensibilities of students. On the notion of intellectual competence, it is vital to note that acquisition and retention of facts is not a sufficient condition for intellectual competence, though it is obviously a necessary one. Sufficiency in matters intellectual involves far more than the mere possession of knowledge. It is also possession of a deep respect for the role of evidence and its place in establishing truth or falsity. It is possession of critical and analytical skills that enable facts and ideas to be poked at, reconsidered, and appraised. It is possession of healthy measures of skepticism, curiosity, and wonder, attitudes that allow us to make progress in our inquiries and stand in awe of our shortcomings as well as our potential. Many of these characteristics are difficult to fathom with quickly scored and easily aggregated tests, yet they are the bedrock of the knowledge and skill that we should acquire as part of our learning. Moral sensibilities, on the other hand, are often ignored in our talk about education, except when speaking of such things as character education or the founding of special schools espousing the ideological convictions of parents with offspring in those schools. When I speak of moral sensibilities, I mean those core human virtues so beautifully captured in a recent work by André Comte-Sponville. He wrote in a small treatise on great virtues, where he explores 18 different virtues, ranging from the foundational virtue of politeness, through gentleness and prudence, to the grander notions of justice and love. These virtues, he argues, constitute the essence and the excellence of humankind. Some of these virtues are more simply, though a bit less elegantly, captured in Robert Fulghum's All I Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Fulghum writes that what he learned in kindergarten is this: share everything, play fair, don't hit people, put things back where you found them, clean up your mess, don't take things that aren't yours, say you're sorry when you hurt someone, Wash your hands before you eat. Flush. Warm cookies and cold milk are good for you. Live a balanced life. Learn some and think some. Draw and paint and sing and dance and play and work some every day. Take a nap every afternoon. When you go out into the world, watch out for traffic, hold hands, and stick together. Moral sensibilities are variously communicated in classrooms, ranging from didactic and homiletic talk by teachers to their students, to norms and values contained in lessons and readings, to the general conduct of the teacher as he or she goes about the work of the classroom. Yet few beginning teachers are helped to understand their roles here, or the various ways they might become engaged in moral development. The third and final teaching reform deals with the allocation of responsibility for learning. In these times, when a student does not learn what is taught in school, it is often the teachers who are believed to be responsible. Seldom do we hear that the responsibility should also be apportioned to the student. Yet we know that students enter the school with radically different backgrounds, interests, and preparation. Somehow teachers are expected to take this potpourri, which may also be made even more diverse by vast differences in physical and mental abilities, and instruct in such a manner that no child is left behind. And teachers are expected to do this in a social and cultural setting where less fortunate students are typically viewed as victims of birth or circumstance. As such, these students are thought to be relatively helpless in their school settings, which in turn leads us to cast the teacher as a rescuer. Those students later found to be unsaved by their teachers are no longer viewed so much as victims of birth and circumstance as they are now viewed as victims of the schools and their teachers. This state of affairs arises, I think, for a number of reasons. One of these I'll call our moonshot mentality. With enough desire, ingenuity, and brains, we can do anything. Thus, if teachers showed the necessary traits, commitment, ingenuity, they could succeed with all their students. A second reason, perhaps, is that schools and teachers are easy targets. They have historically been the primary social institution for the education of the young, and they have accepted this role with a considerable degree of relish. But they are also a relatively weak social institution in that they have little political or economic clout. So when things go poorly for the schools, they are caught between a tradition of accepting responsibility for education of the young and a lack of power to explain their faults by showing how outside factors might bear a greater responsibility for what's taking place inside. From the point of view of the student, it can be difficult to assign responsibility for a failure to learn because he or she has so little choice in what, when, where, and how to engage in studies covered in school. The curriculum is increasingly mandated, as is the format for engaging with it. Lacking a chance to make informed choices, to give or withhold consent, and to exhibit variation in how to approach one's studies, it should come as no surprise that students do not feel a sense of responsibility for so much of what takes place in school. Consider your own experience. What is your level of commitment and willingness to accept responsibility for things over which you have little or no say? Is it difficult to imagine why the student might feel the same? If, on the other hand, learner and teacher are jointly responsible for learning, then a failure to learn on the part of the student is not simply and totally the fault of poor teaching. If it is a shared responsibility, there are a number of things we can do to assure that this will result in a higher level of satisfaction for both teachers and students and higher levels of learning on the part of students. First, a renewed focus on study skills, from the early grades through the later ones. The notion here is to engage the learner in thoughtful, fairly complex, challenging material, while simultaneously not only teaching that material, but helping him or her understand the best ways to engage in and profit from it. A second approach is to offer more opportunities for the student to decide what to study and how to do that. permitting him or her to make a commitment to the task of learning and to take responsibility for the decisions made. A third is to develop expectations for parent involvement in the student's learning, and where there is no or little parent involvement, to offer a remedy other than simply doubling or tripling the burden faced by the school. Herein lies a reason for some of the structural reforms I described earlier, to provide more programmatic options for students, thereby allowing them to make more choices previously unavailable to them. With the provision of choices, it becomes possible to allocate responsibility, as we do when parents say to their children, "You made that decision, now you accept the consequences for it." Well, there you have it, my presidential agenda. Recall, it includes 8 items about the structure and organization of education and 3 about the activities of teaching. The 8 structural aspects, as a reminder: 1, a greater investment in the welfare of unborn children and infants. 2, a reconsideration of when compulsory schooling begins and ends, with a consideration for beginning at age 3 and ending at what is now grade 10. 3, a requirement for 18 to 30 months of national service to be completed in the public sector, military or civilian. To occur during that time, the student would otherwise be in grades 11 and 12. A requirement that every school should be a public school, regardless of source of funding. 5th, a stipulation that each state be required to expend approximately 10% of its school budget in support of experimental forms of schooling. 6th, an expanded and enriched curriculum that attends as carefully to social studies, civics, and the performing arts as it does to language, science, and mathematics. 7, options for advanced vocational technical schooling following a period of national service. And 8, an extended consideration of education from the student's perspective, encompassing all the formal, informal, and non-formal opportunities available to advance the education of the child. The 3 aspects of teaching that I proposed for serious study and change were: 1, improving the teacher's work environment; 2, preparing teachers to foster both the intellectual competence and moral sensibilities of their students; and 3, apportioning the responsibility for learning to both teacher and student. I hope these proposals would be sufficiently provocative to launch an exciting White House conference. As I was framing these ideas, I was reminded of an idea voiced by a good friend and fellow philosopher, Tom Green. He was commenting on a rather famous little book written 3/4 of a century ago by George S. Counts. The provocative title of that work is "Dare the School Build a New Social Order?" This was back in the 1930s, when the United States was getting very concerned initially about communism and the growing threat of the war and so on. And Counts had this dream that public education could uplift the society and extend its capacities and capabilities. Tom Green thought that in this day and age, we should turn the question around to what is now a more vital and important question: dare the social order build a new school? And that's precisely the topic that I've been trying to pursue here today. Dare the social order build a new school? Are we sufficiently daring and courageous as a nation and as a society to redesign education so that it not only meets the needs and expectations of the times ahead, but also to helps us shape these times in ways that advance and ennoble humankind? As we ponder that question, I think it's useful to keep in mind another Thomas Green notion about the perils of policymaking in a technological age. He wrote the following: "There is a profound and tenuous balance that must be secured in our institutions. They must be malleable enough so that good and skillful persons who dream of what is not yet but might be so can be set free to decide and to act. But our institutions must also be sufficiently resistant to change so that those whose conscience is merely technical and limited to the skills of managing the political apparatus, but who are rootless in their souls, may not do irreparable harm." rootedness and vision ultimately are what provide both the only salvation there is for our institutions and the only fixed point for the guidance of persons engaged in public policy. Rootedness and vision. What remarkable desiderata they are, especially for sustaining the education of the young. I wonder, though, whether in their zealous pursuit we might fry ourselves on the wires. But as the Moth would say, that's what life is for. Thank you. Sure, sure.
Professor Fenstermacher will be happy to respond to a few questions. We have a few minutes. You can just manage the process.
I would be delighted to have your questions. I cut pieces out of the speech, hoping I could finish in time so we could talk a little bit about these things. You've got one. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It won't be until next week, but that's okay. You can call me that now. Could you all hear the question about homeschooling? Okay. There was a time that I was considerably frightened by the concept of homeschooling, in part because parents generally have a reputation for expressing their most conservative inclinations to their children and responding. I don't mean just politically conservative. I mean, that's their task in a way. And I worried that there wouldn't be the kind of back and forth engagement, there wouldn't be the interrogation of core beliefs and fundamental ideas that we aspire to have go on in the public setting of the public school. But the evidence is proving me wrong on that score, I think. The little bit that is emerging, I guess what I would encourage, though, is that in the midst of homeschooling, the parents who do it find a way of bringing their children collectively together with those they know to be different, and to encourage the kind of regard and respect that must come in the face of different people, different cultures, different ideas, different beliefs. But I think I'm more prepared now than I was 10 years ago to accept the fact that the monolithic system of public education that we've had in place in this country for so long is, in my view, not going to survive. And that we've got to look and figure out how we're going to deal with alternative forms of schooling and accomplish the best of what public schooling accomplished. Is that responsive to your question? Okay. Yes? Oh, an experiment. Well, I think voucher schools 10 years ago, 15 years ago, would have been a worthy experiment in education. But I also think that traditional approaches to the curriculum, that experimental education, you might have alternative approaches to curriculum. Some of you are, there's a fabulous movement growing up in this may come as no surprise to all of you here, but in other countries, interculturalism is the preferred term, while in the States we tend to talk about multiculturalism. And interculturalism has to do with developing a much more global awareness rather than a kind of cross-cultural awareness in one's own particular locale. And I've seen school programs deeply rooted in interculturalism, as well as schools that have taken an approach to the development of curriculum, a lot having to do with new brain strategies and things like that. And it would be those kinds of initiatives that presented alternative ways of undertaking both traditional education and novel forms of education. Well, what I tried to talk about is I think that the responsibility of the state in this instance, I'm speaking of states like Utah, Arizona, Michigan, of states, is to ensure the acquisition of basic levels of proficiency across the critical subject matter areas. And that after that, it's up to localities and parents to make the determination of what we might call the ceiling effects for education as opposed to the floor effects of education. In other words, what are the minima that we must meet? And in my view, the higher level you rise to in the governance of education, the more responsible you are for setting the floor. And the lower you are in the system, the more responsible you are for setting the ceiling. Am I making sense in that? And so when it comes to measures, I think we could have nationwide or statewide measures for basic proficiencies that assured minimum levels of competency, but we would not try to go for maxima outcomes except at very local levels, and it would be a decision of communities and boards to make those determinations. Wouldn't be a national problem or a state problem. This is kind of going against the flow here, I know. Yes? Right? If we're doing the same old stuff, I don't know why we should do that. You know, it's like the class size reduction stuff. I mean, the data on class size reduction are pretty amazing out there. You've got to get below 14. And we weren't prepared to do that. If you really want class size to make a difference. Now, it's true that if you're a classroom teacher, having a few less students can make a considerable difference to your disposition and the way in which you go about the daily routines of classroom life. But if you want differences in outcomes and you want really different things to happen in classrooms, you have to get down below 14, roughly speaking, somewhere in the 12 to 14 range. We have research that's 40, 50 years old looking at class size reductions that show you take students out of classrooms and teachers continue to do the same thing they did before. It really doesn't alter fundamental approaches to pedagogy. So I guess I have trouble thinking about increasing the number of days in school without making sure that we're fundamentally altering other things. And the other thing that I tried to say here is I think rather than increase days in school, I would rather increase the informal and non-formal opportunities. I mean, parks and recreation and weekend athletic programs and scouting and so on tend to benefit middle and upper class kids. And we talk about having a commitment to that bottom quartile. And one way that we're not fulfilling that commitment to that bottom quartile is offering them much more powerful informal and non-formal educational opportunities. All the way from what's on the Happy Meal bags at McDonald's to there are just all kinds of opportunities which I think we could undertake with that group. And so I'm being long-winded here, but I'm trying to think on my feet while I'm responding that I guess for me, I'd rather see us enhance those educational opportunities for which children seem much more naturally motivated to participate in than to add to school days. Stephanie, and then Win. Okay. You want him to set you up, right? Yes, okay. Right.
And so I want to ask you kind of questions, kind of comments. Would you
That's a pretty easy one for me. And you would have guessed the answer, wouldn't you? Yeah. I'd go for enable us to be contributory rather than competitive. This was the topic of discussion in the group this morning, rich, full of mystery and challenge here too, in the sense that we have so tightly linked the diploma to occupational entry, the high school diploma to occupational entry, that it's down to the point when you listen to teachers talk to kids about reasons they stay in school, it's always about economics. You know, and you have to ask yourself, what have we done when teachers explain their own worth in terms of later jobs? Their own worth, and it just frightens me that we haven't done a better job of merchandising, if you will, education as, I mean, I don't want to give up the competitiveness. I think there are reasons there, but it has to be much more richly balanced and more diversified than the way it is at the moment. And you know, this part of me too blames this ratcheting up of levels of governance, because it certainly is appropriate for federal legislators and the president to worry about America's global position. And they're not going to worry about the character and conduct and caring, things like that. You would think they should be, but that's not part of their focus. But when it comes back down, that's when people start saying, oh, we got to have some balance here, some focus, and attend to more things. Steph. Maybe the easiest way for me to talk about that is to balance the notion of indoctrination with the notion of interrogation. That's, to me, where intellectual competence and moral sensibilities come together. I think young children, we indoctrinate. Politeness is important. There's no question about it. You're going to share when you're here. No, I'm not going to tell you the reasons why. We're going to share. But eventually, we have an obligation now then to take everything we laid down in an indoctrinatory fashion and re-examine it interrogatively, to question it, to allow the student to embrace it as a result of his or her own decision. And this takes a sense of balance, a sense of curiosity, a sense of wonder and appreciation of evidence, things like that. When the Amish send their students out into the world for a year, you know, what they're doing is they're forcing their students to interrogate the values that they indoctrinated so thoroughly in that first 15, 16 years of life. It's a fascinating, you know, Aristotle would have a conniption because he'd say, that's far too late to begin the process of interrogation. And I had an example in here that I cut out about a teacher, a fifth grade teacher doing a unit on environment, and it was so crystal clear to me that she was a tree hugger in the extreme. And I don't have anything against tree huggers, but I wondered to myself, what kind of an obligation does she possess now to interrogate those values that she's laying down for these children? Is fifth grade, should we still be imposing a respect and regard for the environment? Or is it time now to start lightening up a little and rebalancing and interrogating? And that, to me, is the kind of pivot point of where those intellectual competencies and moral sensibilities come together, is getting in a, and we had that teacher and I had a fabulous conversation. At first, she was shocked that I didn't think that was the greatest lesson I'd ever witnessed. And it was a very good lesson if you looked at the way the children were responding to it and things like that. But if you looked at it from that intellectual properties point of view, she was leaving them defenseless when somebody else started attacking their views.
So are you proposing that
Yes, absolutely. That's, I'd say, pitch Rich and I will make for Ed Foundations courses, right? That's what they're supposed to do, I think, when they're going as they should. Yes.
Mr. President-elect,
Yes, sir.
you've given us a rooted vision. You told us about a week conference at the White House and 3 assemblies. Would you share with us some of the people you have in mind to invite, both by tradition and perhaps by name, both for your week conference at the White House, and then the kind of people you think we ought to be talking to when we go to try to talk with the grassroots?
First person I'd invite is a person who asked me that question. How's that for diplomatic? My new presidential response. One of the things that I enjoyed particularly at this morning's session was talking across sectors of society. Newspaper editor, business person, educator, things like, and I just feel that it is so important for us to have this conversation around education across sectors of society. So I don't know if I could name names at this point, but I know that I wouldn't want to have just people in education whose careers are in education. I think we must talk around the boundaries, and it would be state and federal government people, it would be local citizens, it would be educators, business people, philanthropic agencies, NGOs, and these people, by the way, during the retreats that I told you about, those week-long retreats, would be divided up in such a way that they'd be with teams that are composed by sector most of the time. Because I just believe that that's the kind of thing we have to do to confront what we're dealing with in education today, is we have to have people from different walks of life singing off the same piece of sheet music. And what's happening now, as so many of you know, is that the sheet music comes with the sector. We are, in the second volume of this book that I told you about, the Why We Educate book, we invited people from about 25 different occupational categories to say why they think education is important. All the people in business talked about getting employed and economic success. All the people in media and entertainment talked about having fun and enjoying yourself. All the people in the fine arts and dance and so on talked about aesthetic appreciation and developing a sense of beauty and so on. And if you read these passages, you will, I think, be stunned the way I was that they can't talk outside of their occupational frame for what we ought to be doing in education. And I think that's a critical thing we have to break.
Just ask you a follow-up. Within the educational area, either contemporary or historical, who are some of those that you think would be most interesting to bring that piece of the dialogue?
I'm sorry. What's that?
I'm just thinking within the educational sphere,
Yeah?
who else would you consider today more historical? That is to say, either by tradition.
Are you looking for names of people now?
Traditions or people.
People living or dead.
People living or dead who would add something to this discussion coming specifically from the education sphere.
I'm embarrassed. I can think of a lot of names, but as soon as I thought of them, I tossed them. That's really awful. You know, I was a great fan of William James and John Dewey, but of course they're philosophers, and there I go, picking people in my sector, right? But Lawrence Kremen, to me, was one of an educational historian. He's a beautifully liberally educated, well-rounded, wrote some of the best history of education you can find, but just erudite and terrific. Somebody like Lee Schulman, who just stepped down as president of the Carnegie Foundation for the advancement of teaching. You know, and I tell you what's going to come out of my mouth in a way, the Chicago School. My admiration for these broadly prepared, well-rounded, massively interrogated individuals that is characteristic often of Talmudic education, of the of other forms where you're, you know, I don't know if you know Talmudic text, the commentaries are all around, the text is right in the center, and commentaries are all around it from hundreds and hundreds of years of commentary and reaction. And I mean, they're really remarkably good at splitting hairs, so you won't want to go that far. But it's that kind of thing that I think of, that from education, I would like to have there in order to jazz up the conversation across the sectors. So, yes, and then I'll come back there. Yes, sir.
You emphasize the importance of local control.
Uh-huh.
Yet, it seems to me that's the reverse is progressively occurring.
Right.
The locality, individual communities give up control to the state. The state is giving more and more to the central government. It's progressively more centralized. What can be done to reverse that?
If I knew the answer to that, I really would run for president. When we pushed the dollar upstairs, you know, we had 85% local funding 30, 40 years ago. Now it's about, you know, roughly half between local and state in many states, with about somewhere between 7 and 9% federal. We let authority and power follow the dollar. And I'm not sure how best to gain the equity, equity of finance that we were starting to achieve with the redistribution of money while retaining the authority. And this goes back to what I tried to respond to back to you about minima and maxima. I think that my view of how we should try to do that is to convince those who are distal, far from the process itself, that their responsibility is, as my friend Tom Green would say, to keep you off the dole and out of prison. Those are the minimums, off the dole and out of prison. And the local community retains the authority to set the maximum, and the dollar is not driving the maximum. That's the best I think I can do at this point. Sir. Yeah.
What can teachers do to help the students feel more responsibility?
I think that in terms of teachers doing that to help students feel more responsibility, I think opening effective avenues of communication with parents is about the quickest, fastest way. This means letters home, talking about what you're trying to accomplish. It's hard to get parents into schools, but oftentimes if you ask the parent to sign the note that goes home with the child, you can start carefully, briefly communicating to parents consistently over time what it is you're trying to accomplish there, because if they understand it better, I think you will find them being more willing to help you achieve that end. Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, the anthropologist, once wrote that most parents have the same feeling walking into a school that they have looking in the rearview mirror of their car and seeing flashing red lights. And you got to break that down. And that's a principal's job in part, but it's another teacher's job. And I think I would like to see more structural ways over time of getting a better apportioning of responsibility. But quick and dirty, I think that's probably, there are other people here who know this game better than I do. I think who would have much better and more diverse responses. Sir.
So going back to what you said about the dollar, do you see any negative consequences in allowing permanent school funds to be invested into this kind of
This is partly why. The rough and tumble answer right off the bat is no, but I got all kinds of exceptions to that. I think we're headed for much more diverse structural and organizational forms of schooling than we have had in the history of the United States, that we are indeed evolving. And this is why I wanted to argue this notion that there is a core responsibility of a school, no matter who you're funded by or who you represent. And that's the old Jeffersonian idea that you're building a public, you're preparing for governance. And you just have to do, and you have to prove, if you want public money, if you want state money, you have to prove to the state that you are engaged in and fulfilling this responsibility. That's how I would deal with it for now. But I'm reminded of a person who once talked about reading the future was a matter of looking at a whole series of tapestries on the wall, and the front one was disintegrating, and just as you thought you could see the pattern on the tapestry behind it, it started to disintegrate. And thus reading the future was that kind of a problem, and that's what I think we've got here, and we need to approach this thing both wisely but carefully.
Thank you. I'm going to save Professor Fenstermacher from himself. We've got a plane to catch. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you for coming. We'll look forward to your 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th visits to BYU.
Thank you. Pardon? Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you.